right. Fantastic. Well, we have officially started now. I want to go ahead and say hello, everyone. On behalf of our team at Starkloff Disability Institute, I want to warmly welcome you to today's webinar, Inclusive by Nature, Sustainability and Universal Design, which is being held today on October 29th, 2025, in honor of World Sustainability Day. My name is Rachel Goldmeyer, and I'm your host and panel moderator for today. I also happen to be Starkloff's Universal Design Program Coordinator. For a brief physical description of myself, I am a white woman with dark brown curly hair, I wear glasses, and I'm wearing a black shirt with a lot of glitter and sparkles today. We are thrilled to be joined by an amazing lineup of thought leaders and practitioners who are innovating at the intersection of sustainability and universal design. Our speakers today are keynote and panelist Alexa Vaughn and panelists Chris Downey, William Letty, and Stuart Shell. Throughout the session, you're going to hear examples, insights, and strategies that can inform your work, whether you're a designer, policy maker, educator, student, or an advocate. Thank you for taking the time to join us from wherever you are in the world. We had a wide variety of folks sign up, and we're so excited to have such a passionate and engaged audience gathered virtually here today to explore how sustainability and universal design can combine to create more equitable, resilient, and inclusive spaces, both for people and for the planet. Before we dive in, I've got just some quick housekeeping. This session is going to be recorded, and we will be sharing the link to the recording once we are able to have the captions professionally cleaned. Today's event is made up of a presentation, a panel discussion, and then audience participation. That audience participation will be a question and answer session, which will come after our panel discussion. So please drop your questions in the Q&A box as we go along. Please note that the chat is disabled, and all of the communications in the Q&A box will be going to us moderators and hosts and folks in charge for today. There are continuing education units through the AIA and a certificate of attendance available as part of today's webinar. So those will be going out to anyone who requested those items after we've had the chance to take attendance and put everything together. We do have a satisfaction survey for this webinar, and it is our hope that everyone in attendance will take just a few moments to fill it out once our event has concluded. We will be dropping the link for the form right now, just in case anyone needs to leave early. You'll also receive this link again towards the very end of the webinar. Thank you for being here. We hope to leave you today not only more informed, but ready to create change in your work, your community, and beyond. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce our fantastic keynote presenter, who I've had the great joy of getting to know over the last few months, the extremely talented and knowledgeable Alexa Vaughn. She's going to be giving us some important background information on universal design and sustainability before we kick off our panel. So without further ado, please take it away, Alexa.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to go ahead and get my slides up. Okay. So hello, everyone. This is Alexa speaking, and I just wanted to thank Rachel so much for the invitation to give an introductory presentation on sustainability and universal design for today's panel. And I'm a landscape designer and also an accessibility specialist at Sasaki. I'm also the founder of Dovescape and Design with Disabled People Now, and I'm a PhD student in architecture and urban design at UCLA. I'm a late deafened and speaking deaf person, and I'm also a predominantly white woman with long dark hair and bangs. I have blue eyes, and I'm wearing a gray and white striped button-up shirt with a black blazer. My background is blurred today. So my title slide here is a vibrant green with a simple vector graphic of a sidewalk with two people standing next to each other. And there's also a bike riding by. And white text over black is the title, Inclusive by Nature, Sustainable Universal Design. And so today I'm going to talk about how disabled people are actually disproportionately impacted by climate change. They're often completely left out of the design process that significantly affects all of our lives in the disabled community. But disabled folks are experiencing negative and exacerbated health outcomes as a result of rising heat, emissions, and also lack of access to green spaces. Yet sustainability and accessibility are often considered mutually exclusive. This is not actually the case, and so I'm here today to kind of challenge that thought. Today, we'll also have a conversation about these implications for design with a panel following my talk. So with all of this said, and before I dive deeper, I first want to make a note on language today. This slide has an image of a black fist on a white background with the universal access symbol of a wheelchair user on it, and the symbol is also raising its fist within the fist. White text at the wrist reads "Support disability rights." So throughout this presentation, I use identity-first language to describe people who identify with any type of disability. And I also refer to people who don't have a disability as non-disabled people. I do want to stress that person-first language, like people with disabilities, is completely acceptable. My preference personally is to emphasize identity and to illustrate that the word disabled isn't a bad word. It's always important to ask for someone's preferences. And, this is similar to asking for a person's choice of pronouns, for example. But claiming disabled or deaf identity really can create a sense of pride for disabled folks who choose to claim it. Claiming my own deaf identity was very empowering for me, and it dismantled a lot of internalized ableism that I had against myself. So with that note, this next slide has two black bubbles with white text illustrating the medical model of disability versus the social model. At left, the medical model reads, "The person is the problem," with arrows pointing at the bubble. At the right is the social model, which reads, "The built environment is the problem," and arrows point away from the bubble. So one of my primary goals has been to shift how we think and talk about disability, particularly in relationship to the built environment. The medical model is and has been the dominant worldview in the United States, and it treats disabled people as a problem to solve rather than, an attempt to fix the environment. It's the other way around, and we treat them as if they need to fix or cure themselves, and furthermore, adapt themselves to the built environment, sometimes very strenuously. And if it doesn't work out, it's their responsibility to kind of just figure it out or to move on. So as a result of this thinking, we often limit how we think about disabled people's uses of spaces, right? We're thinking about healthcare, we're thinking about medical centers and therapeutic spaces far more than broader public space. But disabled people are actually out and about using public space every day, living in cities, living in suburban areas, wherever it might be. We need to shift to a social model worldview, which views the built environment as in need of transformation, not the person. We shouldn't be forcing disabled people to adapt. We need to focus on fixing the issues that we have ingrained in our public spaces rather than the people who use them. So without disregarding how hard the disabled community has fought for the passage of the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, I believe the ADA standards are slightly limited because they focus predominantly yet limitedly on the needs of wheelchair users and blind or low vision folks. And so this slide has two images taken from the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. At the left is a figure of a wheelchair user illustrating unobstructed side reach, and at the right is a figure of a blind person illustrating limits of protruding objects. We see quite a few figures like this throughout the standards, but there is little to no mention of other disabilities. These guidelines are considered standard measurements, and they often focus on interiors. They are also assumed to cover the basic needs of every disabled person, but this is actually not the case. This quote in white text on black backgrounds by Denise Sher Jacobson in the film Crib Camp, which is still up on Netflix, really sums up why we need to design beyond the ADA. The ADA was a wonderful achievement, but it was only the tip of the iceberg. You can pass a law, but until you can change society's attitude, that law won't mean much. So designers, policymakers, and anyone working with the ADA must claim this responsibility, or the burden does continue to fall upon the disabled community. We need to start thinking more deeply about this because there are over 1.6 billion disabled people globally, and this number continues to rise with population growth, as well as aging population growth. So folks, are living longer lives. They're getting older. Folks at any time in their lives might experience a disability. And many are also drastically impacted by climate change, particularly in the global south. So to put this into numbers, this is roughly 1 out of 6 people in the world identifying with some sort of disability. It might be one, might be multiple. This is also 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 in the US, roughly a quarter of the US population identifying with a disability. Yet despite these statistics, The face of disability is often generalized as a white wheelchair user. In reality, disability is a very broad spectrum, ranging from physical to sensory to neurocognitive and psychological disabilities. So many folks might identify with more than one disability across the spectrum. And the graphic on this slide, which is a series of 4 black bubbles with different symbols for physical, sensory, and neurocognitive disabilities, accompanied by a broad list of categorized disabilities, it's in no way conclusive of the entire range of disabled identities. Many of the disabilities are also considered invisible or not easily detectable with a general glance. Some disabled folks use wheelchairs, canes, hearing aids, prosthetics, glasses, or other devices, while others use none. So disability is not always easy to identify or to understand, but the disabled community is the most diverse and intersectional group on the planet of people anywhere, right? It's a community that anyone might join at any time. So we really do need to account for intersectionality as well as variance as much as possible in design, and not assume that only one type of disabled person is using a space at any given time. So how does universal design come into the picture with all of these things in mind? Here I have a definition of universal design in white text on black background, and this is taken from the Center for Universal Design in 1997. They say that it is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So universal design was created by Ronald Mace, who is an architect, professor, and wheelchair user at North Carolina State. And as I said, this was in the 90s, very close to the time of the ADA. But when we take a look at the 7 principles of universal design, which are listed here in black text on white background, there are equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. These principles, they're somewhat ambiguous and broad, right? But I personally feel this is part of their strength. They can be powerful, creative, and adaptive tools which allow us to look beyond the ADA. Unfortunately, many designers treat the ADA standards as a limitation or something that is untasteful in design. But universal design can help us to think outside of the box to create more accessible and inclusive spaces that include many more people than we currently do. Some things to note about universal design listed here in white text on black background. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach, as much as we would love for it to be. Individual needs and preferences vary widely. It is also not about achieving bare minimums, nor checking boxes on a checklist. It should not be based upon assumptions. We cannot design for the disabled community without directly including the disabled community. And yes, universal design does require direct feedback from the disabled community to be fully successful and holistic. Lastly, it is not merely good design, quote unquote. Universal design has been a buzzword in the collective design consciousness, but I've realized that many folks classify universal design simply as good design, and its nuances remain underexplored. Because really, there are many designs out there that are considered good. They're beautiful and authentic and aesthetic, functional or enjoyable by many people. And this is a rendering of the vessel in New York City, which was designed by IUAP and also Thomas Heatherwick. It's a great example of a gorgeous, aesthetically beautiful design. But as disabled activists have proven, many of them wheelchair users, as shown in these 2 photos of Shannon Finnegan's anti-stairs club lounge in front of the vessel, it's not designed for them. So we must always ask the question, for whom is design good? What defines good, right? A good design may be very exclusive of some. And so the primary goal of universal design is not merely to be considered good design. It is to prioritize the creation of spaces that welcome groups who are historically and presently excluded from public spaces and for generations to come. So one way to begin to utilize universal design is to practice an accessible and inclusive process. Usually, our typical design process looks something like this: a linear diagram of several black bubbles with white text moving left to right. We start with analysis, we move through various design iterations to construction, and then we wrap up. But the question is, where does the disabled community come in? The disabled community has a saying, and it's nothing about us without us. This includes universal design. This is the same linear diagram that I just showed, but now with pink arrows jumping in at different parts. And so the very first step at the beginning of the process, before any major designing is done, should be to identify disabled stakeholders or members of the specific community or place you are designing for. The next step is to host accessible stakeholder meetings and engagement. And this is for any type of stakeholder engagement meeting, whether it be focused on accessibility or not. In addition to general stakeholder meetings, we can begin to host more disabled stakeholder and expert focus group meetings to get very detailed feedback on accessibility and inclusion. Another step in the process that is not frequently practiced is the prototyping of accessible and inclusive design elements. And I know that Chris Downey on the call here today has done a lot of this work with prototyping. This is really to work so that we design directly with disabled people, creating new design elements that go beyond ADA and state code. And then we can also audit our designs to ensure that they're actually built accessibly and according to expectations for a site. And I know I have this located at the end of this diagram, but this can happen anytime in the design process. It can be pre-design or post-design. So in addition to transforming our design process, we can also transform our designs. And I've created this sort of qualitative process that is illustrated again with a set of back bubble diagrams with white text and pink accents. This is essentially a disability-centered design process where we start with the ADA standards as bare minimum or the foundation to build upon, the law, so to speak. The next step is to creatively input universal design principles or other inclusive design principles as an adaptive and creative tool. And the final step is participatory. It's to bring in disabled stakeholders and experts throughout the design process as a qualitative control. So an example of this process here with an accessible public pathway using the same bubble diagram, the path itself we're going to assume is at a compliant slope already, which is less than 5% running slope and less than 2% cross slope. We're going to instead focus on width, space, and amenities, which make the path both accessible at bare minimum and beautiful and joyful at maximum. So this is hypothetical. We can begin with section 403.5.1 of the ADA standards, for example, which essentially it just requires a clear minimum width of 36 inches, that's 3 feet, for an accessible route. But design-wise, it's quite boring and unsafe, right? Only one person can fit at a time. And we see here on the side, there's just one person in a wheelchair on the sidewalk next to a car. However, we could take this a step further, right? By considering the 7th universal design principle. This requires size and space for approach and use. So again, very broad principle, right? But we can be creative with materials, we can be creative with design elements and usability far beyond the ADA. Here in the graphic, we have 10 feet allotted for the sidewalk. And there are many design elements that provide variety and access, such as tactile cues, lighting, furnishings, and plantings next to the street, and also a bike lane. Then we can go a step even further by incorporating direct feedback from a variety of disabled community members, calling for an adjustment further up to 15 feet for comfort at parts of the sidewalk at fullest qualitative control if this is what they desire. So this reclaims pedestrian space very radically, right? This is radical in itself. Here in the graphic, we have even more people able to use and enjoy the sidewalk. We have many more design elements and plantings next to the street and a larger bike lane. So it's not only universally designed, but sustainably designed, which I'll talk about soon. Because we've achieved access, our primary goal, and we've gone beyond the bare minimums of the ADA and state code, it's really just such a win-win because we've created a better designed pedestrian-oriented public streetscape. And it's accessible and it's beautiful. And this is how we begin to create, a more universally designed and sustainably designed world. Looking at this graphic, is this not sustainable, right? This is everything all together in one picture, in my opinion. So we really prioritize the design of the landscape for people and for nature. Universal design and sustainable design come together like two pieces of a puzzle. So circling back on that definition that I gave you earlier for universal design, it's the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. I'll compare it now to sustainable design, a definition here that is included in white text on green background taken from the US General Services Administration website. They define sustainable design as an integrated, holistic approach that positively impacts all phases of a building's life cycle, but also minimizes negative impact on building occupants, not only in the environment. In other words, sustainability is not only about materials and nature, but the human experience as well. So taken together here, I have a Venn diagram with universal design in a black circle at the left and sustainable design in a green circle at the right. They really aren't as disparate concepts as they would seem. Both types of design advocate for a wide range of use, and in so doing, they reduce waste. They centerize kindness. They're kind to the earth and kind to people. They also prioritize interconnectivity, right? Or connectivity of systems, of use, of ecological and human flows. They both thrive upon adaptability. So not single solutions, but many solutions and options. They also plan for the future and for longevity. So for many ages, for many years of use, not to be too worn or thrown out in just a couple of years. And perhaps above all, they both require open-mindedness and innovation. This is where designers come in. We need to learn from the past in order to create solutions for all of the people that we serve in the built environment of the present and of the future. So in landscape architecture, sustainability is a bit of a given. It is central to the entire profession by default because we work with living organisms like plants and trees and bodies of water as media, right? And then we also design for humans and animals alike. While other professions like architecture, interior, and product design might sometimes feel a little bit more challenged, right, to connect some dots of sustainability with the broader environment. But I think the Sustainable Sites Initiative, from my perspective in landscape architecture, is a really great precedent to share. So on this slide is the sites logo, that's SITES, sites, in bright blue, and some black text taken from their website. It is essentially a rating system that guides, evaluates, and certifies a project's sustainability. So this is very much like the equivalent of LEED, that's LEED, or Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design certification. This is like landscape architecture's equivalent of that certification. And essentially it works to mitigate climate change while enhancing biodiversity, conserving resources, and also improving public health, and also connectivity between ecosystems. So again, nature and humans, there's a balance there. So when we take a look at the site's website, they actually have several wonderful sections that illustrate just what I mean about connectivity between universal and sustainable design. So on this slide, I've highlighted in green parts of a screenshot taken from the Human Health and Wellness section, which includes, in a quote, the physical health and well-being of all citizens, which can be improved by site-certified landscapes, and the fact that exposure to nature contributes positively to mental health and well-being, and reduces stress and feelings of depression and anxiety. So not only is sustainable design integral for the well-being of the environment, but also for the people who live in and use that environment. Again, providing access to green spaces and also mitigating climate change and natural disasters is integral to well-being, especially for marginalized populations like the broader disabled community, and when thinking about universal design. So second here is a screenshot of the community benefits webpage. And I found this section really phenomenal, again, because disabled folks are very often left out of conversations about design, let alone sustainable design. So here I have a section of text, again, highlighted in green under community development, which reads, and I quote, "Sites ensures equitable site use for people of all ages and those with disabilities by encouraging landscapes to provide optimum site accessibility, safety, and wayfinding. Site-certified landscapes are also encouraged to involve site users and stakeholders to address the landscape's effects on local residents and promote long-term engagement with the community. Site inspires a stronger sense of identity and meaning for Project Site by involving the community. So really, this is what we have here. The sustainability focused certification here is not centering only, sustainability for the environment, but also community involvement in the design process, and specifically the disabled community's involvement, just as a universal design process does ensure. So building communities and supporting communities, including the disabled community, and ensuring their access to the built environment, their safety, and their well-being is not only inclusive, but sustainable. So to close out my presentation today, I want to share a few final slides on what a universal and sustainably designed environment might look like. So my work as a deaf person has often centered upon the deaf community, as that is my own lived experience. The Deaf Space Design Guidelines were created at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. back in 2010, and their purpose is to create spaces where deaf and hard of hearing folks can not only access, but flourish in, to have a full sensory reach around the body, and to be able to comfortably and safely use visual communication, like American Sign Language. So here on this slide is a graphic taken from my 2018 article in Ground Up Journal, which was titled Deafscape, Applying Deaf Space to Landscape. It's a simple axonometric bird's eye diagram of a streetscape that incorporates 8 deaf space principles in tones of cyan and magenta. So this street is not only universal and human-centered, but also sustainable, as it centers the human experience as well as safety, bicycles, plants, and trees over cars. So I'm going to share a few examples today of projects that apply these principles in real life. It's often unintentional, but they've beautifully combined sustainability and universal design together. This first image is of Barangaroo Reserve in Sydney, Australia. It was designed by Peter Walker Partners. It illustrates a textured transition along the edges of pathways, which provides a really nice tangible material cue, which can assist blind and deaf-blind folks with wayfinding. So thinking about this, how might this also be sustainable? We have here a brick material change, which also differs in color at the edges of concrete and asphalt sidewalks, which, might not be the most sustainable material, but really what it does is the brick serves as a tactile cue to move along and stay centered on the path. This can take many forms and textures in different spaces. We can begin to think more about sustainable materials that might create the same effect. But the site is surrounded by water, and in general, the entire design of the site really enhances ecological systems. So it's a place where humans and nature can coexist. The next image is of Dilworth Park in Philadelphia, and this was designed by Olin. There's a really nice shoulder zone here, which is again a depth space principle. There are areas that include eddies or spaces to step off of the main path. There's plantings and there's furnishings, which are clear and organized spaces here that act as dedicated buffer zones parallel to busy sidewalks or pathways. So this shoulder zone at Dilworth has a really nice textured and visual contrast. It uses permeable pavers, which, unlike solid concrete, will allow for water to seep through. So the sidewalk itself is smoother and darker colored, but it's still semi-permeable. So it's going to allow for storm water to percolate into the soil more than a solid concrete. These surfaces are still solid and smooth enough to be accessible. And there's also a really dense and beautiful planting area at the right at the park, as well as many new trees cooling the sidewalks. And then bikes are also prioritized by providing space to lock them in the shoulder zone. So again, accessibility and inclusion really interlocking here with sustainability. The next image is of Chicago Riverwalk in Chicago, Illinois, and this was designed by Sasaki, the office that I work with now. This illustrates a really nice type of degree of enclosure, which is one of my personal favorite deaf space principles, because what they do is they provide a really nice, safe, semi-private, and secure space for people to see and be seen. Usually, this is in the form of a bench with a high backrest, as we see here. There are long, high-backed custom benches facing the waterfront. It can also be a semi-enclosed space, which adds security at the back to enhance comfort. But when you're a deaf woman like me, sometimes it can be really startling for someone to come up from the back when you can't see or hear them. Many neurodivergent folks with hypersensitivity also really benefit from having buffers from loud urban noise. And so these benches here were custom made using reclaimed teak, which was sustainably sourced. And teak trees actually, absorb, they soak up a ton of carbon. So these were recycled teak planks used to make these benches. The durable materials used throughout the site and the plant species are very resilient to periodic flooding. And they also reduce maintenance while extending longevity. So they hope to create a really vibrant public and accessible space that connects Chicagoans to their waterfront. The next is an image of Tongba Park in Santa Monica, which is very local to me. It was designed by James Corner Field Operations, and it illustrates a variety of ramps, sloped rocks, and stairs all together with a green space or a park. So ramps seem quite obvious, right, from the physical accessibility perspective, but they can also minimize tripping hazards. And here, what's so wonderful is that there are so many options to move through the site. Again, universal and sustainable design are both about adaptability, longevity, and interconnection. So providing options allows for many more people to enjoy a site and to access nature in a variety of ways. While I wish I could share more Deathscape principles today, I'll close with one last image of Discovery Green in Houston, Texas, which was designed by Hargreaves Jones. This is a really great example of shade, which provides glare-free comfort on sidewalks. It eases communication as well as general well-being and comfort, especially as temperatures get higher and higher each year. So while these trees along this wide pathway set with branches are obviously very mature and they've been on site for years, it really demonstrates the beauty of an established tree canopy and the cooling and comforting effect of that shade. I think it makes an important point that we design environments for this generation, but also for the future. So when considering the disabled community and universal design, we can design even more sustainably today in order to create a better tomorrow. So you can find much of what I've shared about universal design and Deathscape up on my website, designwithdisabledpeoplenow.com. And this has a series of toolkits and resources. It's a living website that I continuously add to. And this is a screenshot of the homepage in white text on black background. I also recently launched a network for disabled designers. So if anyone in the audience is interested in joining as a disabled designer or an ally, please go ahead and go over to my website and take the survey under the DDN by LA tab. And I've shared that link with Rachel, which I think she'll drop in the chat later. So thank you all so much. My contact information is up on this slide, and I'm going to go ahead and transition over to the panel and with Rachel back on the line. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexa, for setting the stage for us. That is such a good segue into the next portion of our webinar. So panelists, feel free to start popping back on screen. I am going to give a little bit of information before we get started on the next portion of our event. And I just want to thank everybody again for attending today, being part of this webinar on universal design and sustainability. This free event was designed to be a part of World Sustainability Day in order to examine both universal design and sustainability in closer detail and to provide an idea of how these two areas can work together. Should you be interested in learning more beyond what our panel covers here now, of course, we're going to have some great information for you from Alexa's website, and we'll also have some different ways at Starkloft to stay connected. So please stay tuned for the announcements at the end of our event today to hear more about these wonderful ways to stay in touch. Now, under some brief housekeeping for today's panel, I will be serving as our moderator, and I will have the great honor to do so. I will be asking our panelists some pre-prepared questions. After the panel has concluded, we should have some time to take a few questions from our audience as well. Please feel free to provide any questions you might have in the Q&A box as we move forward. My colleague Katie Fields will be collecting those questions for later, and she will be the one leading us in Q&A once we get there. For both this panel as well as the question and answer section, I do ask that we listen to each other, give everyone an opportunity to speak, and be thoughtful and respectful even if we do disagree. We also want to do our best to keep both our questions and answers concise to leave time for others to contribute as well. And we are all here today because of our desire to learn more about sustainability and universal design. So without further delay, let's turn to our panelists for more. Panelists, this first question is going to be for everybody. I would love if you could please share your name, organization, and title with us, as well as telling us a little bit about the work that you do around universal design and sustainability. And whoever wants to go first, feel free to unmute and get started.
Hi, I'm Stu Shell. I'm a middle-aged white man with a beard that's starting to turn gray, calling in from a little office pod today. I work at Branch Pattern. We're a sustainability consulting and design firm. We have a Just label also through the Living Future Institute. But in my work, I'm focused on indoor environmental quality and the impacts it has on how usable spaces are for people. And excited to join the other panelists today.
Fantastic. Anyone else?
Hi, this is Chris Downey. I'll hop in there. I'm a blind architect in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I've kind of split my career in 20 years of sighted architectural experience with now nearly 18 years of architecture without sight and designing within that space, designing for people with blind and visual impairment or low vision, but also more broadly in the broader disability community, practicing universal design. I also teach occasionally at typically around universal design for the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley. Do a number of things on campus and lecture a lot about universal design and especially design for the blind experience. And noting the request to be concise, I'll apologize for myself being, as I say, my gene pool grew up in the Southeast and Alabama from Tennessee and North Carolina. So I'll do my best to be brief.
I totally understand, Chris. We appreciate your insight so much, though. So don't worry if we go a few minutes over. I think folks will forgive us for all the fantastic insight and enthusiasm that we have.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Letty. I am a white male with white hair and glasses. I'm founding principal of one of the founding principals of Letty Madam Stacy Architects in San Francisco. And our practice has been focused for the last 25 years on what we refer to as mission-driven design, which allows us to work for many nonprofit organizations and help them create environments in service of their missions, which has caused us to come into contact with many inspiring groups, including among them universities and the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California, and a number of other projects where the integration of a sustainable design and universal design is a key goal. So this has been our passion for the last 25 years, and I'm delighted to have a chance to speak with my fellow panelists on this very timely, I think, and important topic.
And Rachel, I'm going to go ahead and reintroduce myself just in case anybody missed it earlier. My name is Alexa Bond, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a late deafened and speaking deaf person, and today I'm wearing sort of like gray and white striped button-up shirt with a black blazer, and I have long dark hair with bangs. I'm a predominantly white woman. I'm a landscape designer and also an accessibility specialist at Sasaki. I'm a PhD student at UCLA, and I'm also the founder of Deafscape and Design with Disabled People Now. And so I've been practicing for about 10 years at this point. I consider myself a disability-centered landscape designer. So all of my work really just revolves around sustainably designing the built environment to, fit the needs and preferences of the people we design with and for, with really just a particular emphasis on bringing the disabled community directly into the process. And it's really funny because I think I actually met Chris about 10 years ago, around the time when I was a grad student, I think actually undergrad possibly, so maybe even longer ago. But Chris has always been a really great inspiration to my work from the blind side of the spectrum. Obviously, I'm on the opposite side as a deaf person, but we do find that there are some parallels in our experiences, and we're all fighting the same fight for an accessible world. So thank you so much for having me today.
Yes. Thank you all for being here. I also wanted to add, Alexa made a really great point. I know we've had a few more people jump on since we started. So if anybody didn't get a chance to see my introduction, my name is Rachel Goldmeyer, and I work with Starkloff Disability Institute as the Universal Design Program Coordinator. I have dark curly hair, I wear glasses, and today I'm wearing a black sparkly top. So now that we've done introductions of the moderator and our panel, my first question after that is going to be for Chris and Alexa. And I wanted to ask, since today is World Sustainability Day, how do architects and landscape architects typically think about and use the word sustainability in their work? And how might this be different from how the general population thinks about sustainability?
Okay, thank you, Rachel. This is Chris Downey, and I've got to step back. I've already stumbled. I'm the blind person, and I failed to give you the visual description of myself. I can tend to be forget that, but I am visual. Despite being blind, I'm a tall, blind, pale-skinned guy with not much hair to speak about, and let's see, blue eyes. I think I'm wearing a blue shirt. So anyway, now that that's covered, diving into the question at hand. I've long thought about this intersectionality between universal design and sustainable design really as being so through the lens of social sustainability, that it's not sustainable if it wastes social capital, social enterprise, social abilities, the whole social fabric. And it's about how people engage, how the architecture, how the design, how the landscape, the city can maximize the engagement, productivity, and contribution of all people. And it's just, you can't think about anything about sustainability that wastes human capital. So that's where I really like to focus on it, is through sort of reducing friction, increasing resiliency, recognizing resiliency in the human condition, that the human condition is incredibly diverse. There are all sorts of different modalities, abilities, perspectives, cultural things. And so to the extent that it's to be sustainable, it's got to have that real connectivity and real welcome and really sort of afford that sense of belonging for everyone to be their best, to contribute, to be who they are as they are in that space, as we all sort of endeavor together for a sustainable planet, and all about sort of maximizing our experience here, maximizing the Earth's longevity and the human longevity in the space and our contributions within it. So thank you.
Definitely. And Rachel, I'll go ahead and pick up after Chris. This is Alexa speaking. But Chris, I really like what you said about social sustainability. And I think, the thing about landscape architecture is that sustainability is really a given and at the heart of all that we do, in my opinion. I think, we design with plants, we design with animals, we design with humans, essentially with nature as our medium all the time. And so I think a lot of us are just always attempting to create built environments that are really good for the planet and also good for people. which, we try to balance nature and culture essentially, and we aspire to really just fit the needs of both the current generation with an eye to the future generation. And I think landscape architects have really been thinking about climate change, for decades. It's really just deeply ingrained in the work that we're doing today. And in my mind, landscape architecture is often a tool used to create more environmentally friendly spaces that, are surrounding buildings, making up entire cities, on top of buildings, in people's backyards, whatever it might be. It really has the capacity to work, though, at like a larger scale than many other fields. And I think that's both a challenge and a superpower of landscape architecture, to really think about sustainability and universal design at really large scales, I would say.
Thank you both so much. Wonderful answers to get us started. Next, I'd love to bring Stu and Bill into the conversation for our next question. Given that architects have already become quite skilled at applying ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act requirements, why do we need more information on inclusive design and universal design that extends past those Americans with Disabilities Act requirements?
So this is Bill Leddy. I can jump in on that. I think it's as Alexa, I think, very eloquently put it, the ADA is considered a basic minimum for inclusive design. And just as we all know, despite all of the hard work that the disability community put into getting that passed, we really do need to go way beyond it. And so in our practice, we're always looking for simple ways to make environments that are welcoming to everyone, and regardless of their physical ability or neurocognition, age, or other individual factors. So, we found over the years that integrating universal design strategies into all of our projects, it doesn't cost more. It just makes them better. They celebrate the rich diversity of the human condition, as Chris was mentioning earlier, and they just simply provide more grace and delight in our world.
I see a few things that make it easy to feel like we've got it figured out in the design world, especially. There are a lot of codes and regulations, more all the time, building certifications to master. And once you've got your hands around that code, you can feel like, okay, I know how to do this work. But what Chris was saying about social sustainability, I feel like helps reveal some of the mindset that we get in the habit of holding in the design world, which keeps us from realizing more radical, inclusive design and universal design. And one of those is thinking of ourselves not as helping to deliver a building or renovation, but being more like stewards of buildings. In fact, all of the buildings in our community. And when you see a designer's role in that more civic environment, it allows us to take some accountability for the differences in equity that exist between buildings, and allow us to even see that buildings are a reflection of how we treat each other. And so you can almost read the buildings in a community to understand where the issues are, what the condition is of social justice. And that gives us an entry point to a richer conversation, even with our customers. Another thing I think we often don't lose sight of is the cost of excluding building users from our buildings. And what I mean by that is engaging with people that from the whole community. I mean, we are very connected and we rely on each other as a social species. And so when we're able to bring in the breadth of all of the diversity represented in our community, it makes our lives richer, and it allows us to come more in direct experience of the full of all that the world has to offer us. I know that might sound a little bit poetic, but if we're designing a restaurant and it's not going to be usable because there's no private space for somebody that needs that accommodation, then we're creating a restaurant that's not going to offer some important experiences for the people that will be dining there. And that's what I mean by falling into the habit of accepting the mindset of it's this project that's in front of me, and I'm only designing with the traditional framework in mind.
Yeah. When I started my job as Universal Design Program Coordinator for Starkloff Disability Institute, I sometimes got some concerns or some criticisms raised about universal design. And one of those actually was, aren't ADA and universal design the same thing? And that one I heard a lot. Another one that I did not hear as often, but that was still present, was, isn't universal design completely non-compatible with sustainable practices? How can these two things possibly work together? So for my next question for Alexa and Stu, I wanted to ask, in your experience, do the two concepts of universal design and sustainability typically work together, or can they be at odds with each other?
Definitely. Thank you, Rachel. And I hope that I illustrated this a bit in my talk for folks who were present. I really do think this is a common misconception because they really do go hand in hand. You know, you can't have one without the other. And I think while the word universal is sometimes difficult to achieve, it certainly encapsulates sort of like not only the human life, but plant life, animal life, you know, the world, even the universe, if you will, like thinking at that larger scale of impact. But I think really both universal and sustainable design are advocating for wide ranges of use, you know, with flexibility, with adaptability. Again, as I mentioned in the presentation, really centralizing kindness, centralizing interconnectivity, longevity for many generations. That also require just a ton of open-mindedness and innovation. I think that's really a question that we have today, is like, it's not really, you know, how disparate they are, but how we can purposefully bring them together. And that's really a task for designers, I think, today, to really think about that critically. And they're both, you know, as a result, really tied to responding through learning curves and hard work on that behalf of designers to create meaningful and holistic change. And then also briefly sort of circling back to what Bill had said about the cost, I guess, of like designing accessibly or universally. I don't think about it that way. It's really more of a sustainable investment, right? To choose to design inclusively. A lot of our clients don't think in these terms yet. And it's really, I think, the task of the designer, of the architect, of the landscape architect, of the planner, to frame both universal design and sustainable design together, not as an extra cost, but as really like a meaningful investment, right, for this generation and for the future. That's what I would say about that.
I feel like the underpinnings of sustainability are a thoughtfulness for others. From my generation, we were familiar with the Bronlin report, this idea that sustainable development meets our current needs without compromising future generations, as a kind of canonical definition of what we mean by sustainability. That report was called Our Common Future. More recently, well, about a decade ago, Pope Francis's encyclical was named Our Common Home, Laudato Si, and that helped reframe the discussion to bring bring it much more present and real, and that we don't have to wait for future generations to measure our kindness and compassion and sustainable progress. We just need to look at the people that we're living on this planet with today and be in accountability and be in community with them. And that's the principles of sustainability, whether it's related to greenhouse gas emissions or energy use or material, they relate to how we make space in our habitat and do that in a way that's fair to each other, which is really pretty much how I see a commitment to universal design. It's about what can we do right now to be equitable to the community that's in front of us. And so it is a trap saying, well, isn't universal design just good design? Isn't sustainability just good design? And yes, to go back to the point I was trying to make before, I think what we're missing is that when we design, we're working with social fabric. and we're either contributing or choosing not to engage with the progress of our culture.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, panelists, you're doing such a great job. Thank you for keeping this discussion going. One of the things I was thinking about when compiling these questions and now speaking to the group, some folks might be looking for some specific examples of inclusive design features that are also climate adaptable. So Alexa and Bill, can you share a few examples you can think of that incorporate inclusive design and also being climate adaptable?
Definitely.
Alexa,
Bill, do
go
you want to
ahead.
take that first or shall I? Okay, I think
Go
I'll go
ahead.
ahead. And I think, I did share some case studies at the end of my talk, but I think really some of the interlinked features of those design features that I showed were really just embodying both inclusion and climate adaptability. And one of those examples was planting trees, which really it seems so simple, but it's so impactful to really be intentional about planting trees, planting certain plants, because we think about the future generations while doing this, the present generation as well, but really, as they get established, they provide so much shade, they provide so much cooling. We're getting a lot better about species selection. I feel like we're also planting for longevity, better technology. We have silver cells that, are going into the ground that are helping with the tree roots, which keeps them from, busting through the sidewalks and creating inaccessibility in like 50 to 100 years. And really shade is just so integral with global warming to ensure that folks are, not overheating. It reduces fatigue and glare and discomfort. But we can also think about sustainable materials in general when designing for accessibility. A lot of folks think that accessibility is ugly by default, but that's simply not true. It's also not always using concrete. Like we can think about using recycled materials or even carbon neutral materials to create really just like inclusive furnishings that are also really beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. And like when it comes to sidewalks and pathways, we do often think of concrete as that default for accessible paths, but while this is often true, there are new technologies now that are allowing concrete to be more pervious or, porous terrain. There's also a ton of paver types that are accessible, which have, very small gaps in between that will just let the water through without impeding a wheelchair user. Um, Also, lots of new tech for lighting. I think lighting isn't mentioned a lot as a design element. I'm certainly not an expert in lighting, but we're being more sustainable with bulb types, with energy use, while simultaneously just really ensuring that folks can see in the evening. They're reliant on eyesight and also just generally having a feeling of safety. So I could kind of go on with these smaller design elements, but I think that's what immediately comes to mind. And I'd love to hear what Bill has to share as well.
Thanks, Alexa. I think, not to put too fine a point on it, I think we all know that the next 10 to 20 years are going to bring an enormous amount of change to our planet and to our lives. We're building environments that hopefully have at least 100 years lifespan. So these environments that we're creating are going to be living through this drastic, by all predictions, change in how our species inhabits this planet. So, I think if you look at it from that perspective, I think the design really is, a fundamentally a social justice issue, and that everyone deserves to have not just healthy, inspiring places to live and work, but inspiring places in the future for future generations. So I think, to get more specific, I think in the built environment, I think there are, let's say, at least three obvious. I mean, beyond the points that Stu and Chris have made, I think that there's this sort of a profound ethical component to it, but I think a practical aspect of it. Let's take uh, the fact that, and it's also been mentioned that I think the primary point of intersection here is between inclusive design and healthy regenerative design is that climate change is already disproportionately impacting elderly people, people with disabilities, under-resourced communities across the planet. And we just witnessed Jamaica being inundated with one of the strongest hurricanes ever, and how long it's going to take them to respond. So I think let's talk about just three basic things. We could go on forever on this, but healthy indoor air quality is huge. Especially when you imagine that when you realize that 1 in 4 Americans, that's over 84 million people, suffer from some form of chemical sensitivity. And so I think again, providing, in sustainable world, we've been trying to think about indoor air quality for a long time. But when you put the lens of chemical sensitivity over that, you realize that once again, this is a social justice issue, creating environments that welcome everyone, both physically and also in terms of their chemical environment. But again, I think as the rising frequency of wildfires continues to occur across the nation and the planet, providing healthy indoor air quality during ever increasing smoke events has become a key element of climate resilience. And so, a lot of the affordable housing projects that we do for formerly homeless individuals, for example, have become resilient centers for their communities, so that when we have big smoke events, which will continue to happen in the future, people who are living on the streets can come and go to those community places for a sense of relief and fresh air. Thermal comfort is another huge item, of course, and many people with disabilities living with disabilities have a variety of chemicals or thermal comfort sensitivities. And as the planet warms and we have more and more heat waves, it's absolutely critical that we design environments that can, in a low carbon way, provide thermal comfort and relief from that changing climate outside. And then finally, this is something that Alexa, I think, spoke really nicely about, the idea of biophilic design. This sort of one of the many things that we all share as human species. This need to have meaningful connections with the natural world, and I think once again, as we're transitioning through this period of time into, I think, what most people agree is going to be a more urban environment in the future, low carbon and transit-oriented environments. We need to provide as much connection to the rhythms of the natural world as we possibly can to help provide us all with that nurturing component and lifting our spirits in difficult times. So I think those three are really key elements where there's a really, I think, important interconnection between inclusive design and resilience.
Yeah. And I think, Bill, that was really great. I want to tie that in also just with this general thought that, humans are entitled to food, to shelter. It's part of human life, living a dignified life. And I think really that right to sustainable and accessible design is really tied in to this just human right, to being able to access like beautiful spaces that are healthy and safe. And I think all of these points tie into creating that type of space. So thanks for bringing that up, Bill.
I thank you both so much for that answer. I greatly appreciate the tie-in to human life and human health. And I think that's one of the reasons that this next question is so important. Because one of the things I wanted to ask Chris and Alexa, what are some ways that building with sustainability and universal design in mind can protect human health and really keep us healthier for longer?
Hi, this is Chris Downey again, and it's a really great question. I want to take it on a couple of different levels. A lot of the work that I do within the blind and low vision community is a lot about sort of good eye health, good visual accessibility, and thinking about the visual environment for those with low vision conditions, but also for the general population. And it's something we don't often think about, but there's so much that we can do in the way we design the visual environment that can maximize a person's visual acuities or minimize it. It's something we don't really think about as designers, that we, in effect, can blind people while they're using our environment. That creates stress, and that's a function of designing the visual environment in ways that don't offer good visual contrast, that don't control glare, that don't that expose you to direct light, all sorts of things in the visual environment that can, on one hand, maximize visual acuities within the space, but also sort of relax. It can help relax your eyes, de-stress your condition. And so much about good design, about universal design, is about removing stress, removing friction, and making the environment more suitable. So when you apply that to sustainable design, and you look at sort of the lead criterion things, there's a lot of emphasis on natural daylighting, but there has to be good control of natural lighting. That if you have a west-facing environment, a west-facing glass wall, you've got to be mindful of glare coming in the low afternoon sun angles, and thinking about if it's a private space or a public space. If it's a private space, you can just have manually operated blinds, something where it's a flexibility in use, one of the principles of universal design. But then, so you could tune it to yourself. You could also tune light fixtures to not only control the level of light, but also the color of light. So you can maximize your visual comfort and your visual acuity in your own personal space. That might be a workspace, a living space, whatever. But when you leave that and go into the public space, where an individual may not be able to control that, then you need other kind of smart building systems where you might need to have light sensors that would automatically deploy blinds that could be just shading to knock down the levels of direct light, so it could still allow light and views to come through it, but get to a desirable, comfortable level of glare and direct light control. And all of that, on one hand, you might say, well, it's just simple lighting things, but that's all about human comfort, human longevity, and sort of getting the building environment, the environmental quality to sort of support that comfort and space and maximize your productivity and enjoyment of that space. And that gives me to sort of the second and more global thing. And it's linked to two different ideas. One is something I came across years ago in reading through, of all things, a disability awareness merit badge for my son's scout troop, in which it talked about disability, and it also defined what it was, but it also just said that a person with a disability isn't disabled until a barrier is put in their way. That's a really challenging thing to read as an architect, as a designer, as a landscape designer, you name it. We're in the business of designing environments and things and places for people, and there's obviously the call to do no harm. Yet there are things that we do. Some of it we know, some of it is covered by code. Much of it we're learning. We're continuing to learn in this feedback loop of design and life. And as we're taking accessibility beyond, as Alexa pointed out, from largely about mobility and then some about visual impairment, but now going into deaf space and neurodiversity, all sorts of different things, that barriers we never knew that existed, that we were throwing up in people's way, that was minimizing their ability to thrive, to belong, to be comfortable. And then that is sort of where it comes to the biggest, I think, element of this, And that is the idea of accessibility or universal design, not just being a question of functionality. And I like to think about it as providing access to joy, to delight. That it's not just about getting through the door, it's about really belonging. A lot of it has to do with connection to the environment, connection to the earth, as was just said about having that connection to the earth. That's about sustainability. But it's also about connections to each other, social connections. So it's all about sort of creating that sense of belonging that instills joy, which is good for the human experience. It's good for longevity. It's all about creating a delightful existence and presence here on Earth in the environments that we create.
I totally agree, Chris. And yeah, I think, a lot of the time we're trying to just check those bare minimum boxes of accessibility, of health, of sustainability. And I think it's important to note that joy is really what is going to be the factor of change here when we're centering joy for all communities. And so it's really important to note, as I mentioned earlier, that climate change is disproportionately impacting the disabled community and also communities of color who might also happen to be disabled. So ensuring that communities at a bare minimum have access to green spaces in general, which includes, street trees, urban trees, nature, just all across the board, essentially will really help to create healthier and safer communities that can experience joy outside. And so many communities don't have any access to parks, to greenways, to bike lanes, to anything. And this is really just a major injustice to these communities and prohibiting them from experiencing joy within their own communities. So a recurring theme here, I think, that central link is really just social justice and environmental justice going hand in hand with disability justice and racial justice. Because we can't build environments that disregard these critical needs in any community. And so really architecture and landscape architecture and even planning, we have the capacity to really build with both sustainability and universal design in mind to create real and lasting change for healthier communities that are not just healthy, but also, again, going beyond those bare minimums to give them joyful spaces to enjoy.
Yeah, such a great, impactful, and timely answer all around for both of you. I wanted to ask, moving forward into the future and thinking about what the future might hold. This question is for Chris and Stuart. What are some future trends around sustainability and universal design? What improvements would you most like to see put in place?
Yeah, I can start that. What you were just saying, Chris, made me think of salutogenic design, which is gaining, I think, a little bit of more recognition or awareness. And there's a salutogenic design guide. Jan Golombowski has been a proponent of this for the last decade or two, but I won't go into all the details, but it's basically some guidelines for what buildings need to help people thrive, not just to avoid illness. And so they include things like how to incorporate meaningfulness and manageability into the environment. And comprehensibility is a key aspect emphasized by salutogenic design. I think a lot of those principles are really captured also in this ISUD certification that I've seen gaining some traction. I know there's certification exhaustion, but this is Innovative Solutions for Universal Design. It comes out of the University of Buffalo, I think. But they really put into actionable guidelines some of the principles we've just been discussing here about especially wayfinding, designing for individuals with cognitive impairment, and opening our eyes to the communities that might be staying at home currently because of how we're designing. I wanted to say the Deaf Space Design Guide, I think, is excellent. It provides a lot of visuals to help people that are in the building layout. And Alexa, was glad to see you highlighting that as a resource. It's probably underutilized still, but talking about creating social space with our design, that seems like I'll So just to reiterate, check out the salutogenic design guide. Check out the ISUD certification, especially if you have customers or clients or building users that want to see verification for an inclusive approach. And then the depth space design guidelines is just, again, good design.
Thanks, Stuart. That's some great stuff there. When I think about this, and maybe it's a function of being in the San Francisco Bay Area, thinking about technology and things, and I'm thinking about all the possibilities of smart building design. And when I think about it in this space, it's about sort of smart building systems that can flip the paradigm a bit so that the buildings start to bend to accommodate our needs as opposed to us having to bend around to accommodate the imposition of the architecture or the systems. So thinking about smart system is something on a simplistic level, I think about it in connection to sustainability. I think how ironic it is with no light perception at all for me to walk into a room and with motion sensors to automatically turn on the lights and turn them off when I leave, when they never needed to go on in the first place. So it's I think about it in terms of, you know, smart building technologies that can be aware of who's in the space, who's occupying, who's approaching, and the building can naturally, the environment might naturally get tuned to those particular needs at that time. And other things, there are things that happen like oriented dispatch elevators, destination oriented elevators, where you request the floor you want to go to before you get on the elevator. The efficiencies, the electricity saved is tremendous through those systems. The human interface from the non-visual interface is, even though they've created some systems and some accessibility within it, it's the best of the accommodations within those environments are suboptimal at best. No one would choose that. It feels like an adaptation to what was originally sort of excluded the blind experience from that kind of design that evolved. So just because it's a smart building system, just because it's saving energy, doesn't mean that it's good for humans. It's good for the human interface. Going back to the dispatch elevator system, if anybody's been around those things, what do you do when you see an open door and you're rushing into the elevator lobby? You get into it, and then people realize, oh my God, where are the buttons? So there's all sorts of things that back to the idea of universal design, principles of universal design, simple and intuitive use. Maybe it's a function of patterns, human life patterns, but being mindful of those simple things that are simple and intuitive, and the responsibility of being mindful of, if you break that pattern, of being really clear and deliberate in terms of reestablishing, reaffirming those systems to make those new smart building systems work. So it's not a silver bullet, but has a lot of possibilities if we get smart building systems to naturally bend to our needs as humans, as occupants, and that can extend not just to the building, but to the landscape around us.
Thank you so much for those really thoughtful answers. I know throughout this discussion we've spoken a little bit about events such as climate disasters, COVID pandemic. So I really wanted to get Bill and Stu's thoughts on how has the COVID pandemic and recent climate events impacted how we think about building sustainably and with inclusion in mind.
I think this is Bill Eddy. I think what we're seeing, and I think that one of the threads running through this conversation today is that the line, if there ever was one, between architecture and public health is getting more and more fuzzy, and that our buildings are really fundamental role players in the general health of the public. So one experience I had recently during the pandemic was that we designed a school that was, net zero energy and designed to connect with nature and all those good things. But one of the realities of it was that since it was designed in a way to maximize connection to the outdoors and maximize natural ventilation, um, it was a school that actually it was completed in the middle of the pandemic, and it was actually able to bring kids back to class before many other schools were actually back in session because of that interconnection to the outdoors. So that the spaces were abundantly ventilated and were allowed the students to move out into outdoor spaces that were designed for outdoor learning to uh, change things up and make sure that they were all being healthy and protected. So I think it's another example of how the integration of these buildings to the natural world can also make them healthier in when we have events like pandemics, which we will have again. So I think that's another component to be thinking about here.
Yeah, we really got to experience that firsthand. The way buildings play an important role, especially our schools, in connecting community. And, unfortunately, what happens when we don't have that opportunity for the social interaction and the community connection? Really appreciate its value when it's gone. And we also realized how connected we are globally, that we were all navigating this in similar challenges and all trying to adapt our buildings. Now we have ASHRAE standard 241, so you can encourage your projects to achieve that for emergency design for that next pandemic. So we're not in as tough of a spot. But for me, the real lesson is that recognition of the role buildings play in creating social spaces, and let's internalize that as a call to action to bring the people to our buildings and public spaces who have been excluded because there's not a private space at the movie theater, because there's not a breakout space in the classroom, because it's too confusing to figure out which room I'm headed to in that public office. Those are all barriers we're not feeling guilty about, but it's time for us to start carrying some of that ownership in the design world.
Thank you so much. So, full disclosure to our lovely audience, we are running a little bit behind. So, this next question is going to be our very last panel question, and we're going to try and get in at least one or two Q&A questions because I know we've had some great ones. We are probably going to wrap up 5 to 10 minutes late, so I just want to make sure everybody is aware. And if you do need to leave exactly at 3:30, know that we will be recording this and we will get that out. But for the last question for this panel, it's going to go to Chris and Bill. And I really wanted to hear, is there a project that you have worked on that incorporates sustainable and inclusive practices or sustainability and universal design? And what did you learn from being part of that project?
Okay, I'll jump in there. This is Chris. I was thinking about a project for the Washington State School for the Blind, a project called it's a Life Skills Training Center, two different programs. One, the primary program being for transition age youth, for students that are blind that have graduated from high school, ready to head off to school, to college, to technical school, to work, but they don't necessarily have their own independent living skills to be able to thrive on their own. So it's an academic year to be within this residential facility, developing those independent living skills. And it's located in Vancouver, Washington, just north of Portland, Oregon, just across the border. And it's an environment that we really tried to sort of develop a connection for the residents to each other, but also to the space, and to let the environment of the building be infused by the exterior environment around it. And largely the building embraces a Western courtyard that has an herb garden, that has a barbecue grill, and it also has a water feature that it rains a lot up in that area, that collects water on the roof and then drops it down on top of a water feature, a little splash pad to animate sort of the natural environment. But all of that was about creating this sort of multi-sensory courtyard experience that would infiltrate the building and straight through the building and connect out to the front door, so that when you came in through the front door, you could be aware of the interior environment, but also sense right at the core of the building, all the activity, the people there, all that's going on, but also being welcomed by the sensory experience of that courtyard at the sort of at the heart of that space, all about creating that connection to place, connection to each other, and connection to the environment. And so much of that was led by sustainability through all the material choice, the design choice, the efficiencies of the space, but also merged beautifully within the human experience of what those residents would be experiencing and sharing, importantly, sharing with each other in that sense of community.
Hi, Ability again. This is, I think a large part of our practice is in the design of affordable supportive housing for formerly unhoused individuals and disabled veterans and seniors at risk of homelessness. And so we integrate sustainable and inclusive practices really in just about every project we work on. And sometimes, people ask us, how do we do that? And sometimes we just forget to mention it to our clients. We just sneak it in. And I would say that, I could talk forever about the Ed Roberts campus that Chris and I worked on together years and years ago now, and that's had a big impact on my career and my life. But also, I think most recently, another collaboration we had together was it's a very humble little project at UC Berkeley. The thing that was, I think, intriguing for us about it was that it was a 1920s era building that was right in the middle of UC Berkeley's campus, and they wanted to convert this into the center for the Disabled Students Program at UC Berkeley, which of course was founded by among other people in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s by Ed Roberts. So there was a beautiful poetry there of having worked on the Ed Roberts campus, which is an international center for the disability rights movement in Berkeley, California, and then really almost 20 years later, working on this disabled students project, which incorporated the adaptive reuse of an old building so that's inherently sustainable, incorporated lots of non-toxic materials, and made the building welcoming to the broadest spectrum of folks possible.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, panelists. When, I had originally conceived of the idea for this webinar and reached out to you, this is even better than anything I could have imagined. So that's all the time we have for the panel portion, but you all did a fantastic job. Your time and expertise is so valued. We would like to get in 1 or 2 Q&A questions. Is that okay with the panel? Just to give them an opportunity? Great. So we'll get in 1 or 2 of those, and then I'll go ahead and wrap us up. But in the meantime, I'm going to pass over the microphone to Katie Fields and have her read off at least 1 or 2 audience questions and see what our panel thinks. Take it away, Katie.
Thank you, Rachel. This is Katie. Excellent job to our panelists. I was writing down different quotes that you said, and one of the things that's really stuck with me is what you said, Stu, about buildings are a reflection of how we treat people. And I think in conversations where I do a lot of education around disability, accessibility, universal design, I think that people don't always see that connection. So I just love that you put it into really accessible language. So a few questions. We only have time for 1 or 2. So first one is a question for Stu, Bill, or anyone else on the panel. With COVID-19 continuing to circulate and prevent access to public spaces for many, have you come across any efforts in the broader indoor air quality, universal design, and sustainability conversation to foreground ventilation and air filtration as a present-day necessity for making indoor spaces more accessible?
Stu, you want to grab that one?
Well, this is a hard thing for me to answer because I've seen a little less interest recently in air quality. It was great to have initial traction. We have more tools now than we used to, including ways of using tracer systems that are much simpler than historically we were to verify that spaces are providing infection management. With that said, I think just social awareness and continuing to destigmatize mask use feel like important behavioral norms that we can think of ways of encouraging with our buildings.
Excellent. Thank you, Stu. Okay, one last question, and this is for anybody. As an emerging professional entering the profession with intention of being an advocate for sustainable and universal design, how can we communicate these principles and understandings to the wider public? Are there frameworks for interdisciplinary organizing to carry this conversation to a wider audience for positive change?
I think
Great
maybe
question. Go for it.
yeah. I think it's a difficult task, it's a challenge that we have, as designers to really make all of our work understandable, digestible. I think that, there was a good comment made about accessible language, which Stu said about building, like our challenge really is to make everything just easy to access for all of our stakeholders and for our clients. And it's not just about creating, beautiful graphics, but also the accompanying text or presentations to the public. I think really what it comes down to is having a core understanding of these concepts yourself and then being able to really put them out there into the world. Part of being a designer is being an educator, and I can personally attest to that, being kind of in between the designer and the scholar with the work that I'm doing, like really bridging that gap between, research and practice, and getting that information out to the world is really part of our job. So I think it's a really important question to ask, and I'm not sure that there are specific frameworks that I know of. I think a lot of our task is also amplifying research, amplifying, organizations and stakeholder groups, whether it be StarClaw, whether it be local disabled groups who are doing work on the ground for communities, ensuring that the work that they're doing is also integrated in our work, is being amplified through the design process, making sure that these stakeholders that are usually underrepresented are being prioritized in the process. something that I personally try to do with the disabled community in general. So yeah, I think it's just a mixture of, being aware of everything that is going on in the whole picture of the design that you're working on, because nothing is really done in a bubble. Like a lot of the time with design, we're not starting from scratch. We're working with existing conditions, and we don't just erase those conditions. We have to work very closely with them and have a very detailed and thorough understanding of what's going on in the built environment already. So I would say spending time in the analysis period and throughout the design process to really get a grip and a sense of like what's going on with the environment and with the people that you're designing with and for is a huge part of making sure that we're communicating all of our understanding of sustainable design, of universal design, of the needs of the community. It's a difficult task. It's not easy. So
I'd like to pick up on that, Alexa. This is Chris. I think, like Alexa said, yeah, what that framework is it immediately clear in terms of what's out there that I'm aware of today? But I would point back to a word in your question, and it's a word that we as architects and designers don't use enough or don't use, and that's advocate. We're to be advocates not just for the earth. I think we've been doing a good job about that. The business, the profession is coming around maybe to being advocate for the people, but advocating designers, architects, as landscape architects, as urban designers, being true advocates for the people not in the room, people that we need to bring in the room, for those on the periphery. I think we've heard it from Bill and how he does that in his work. Alexa's talking about, so it's all there, but being very mindful and of that word advocate to bring that sort of function, that real intentionality to our work. So thanks for using that word.
Absolutely. I think advocacy is huge. So I think, advocacy is not just the job for all of these nonprofit organizations like Starcloth. Like they play a huge role in being advocates and allies for the disabled community and underrepresented communities, but it's not only their job, it's our job as well. And I think making that choice to being an advocate and an ally, is really one of the most important choices that you can make as a designer, because it pushes your work to the next level of impact. It's not based on assumption. It's making sure that you're hearing as many voices as possible in the process.
Excellent. Thank you for such thoughtful answers. I'm going to pass it back to Rachel to close us out.
Oh my gosh, wow, time has really flown by. Thank you again, panelists, and thank you, Alexa, also for bringing in Starkloff into your answer. I was very touched by that. I really appreciate all the work that you all have done to bring this together. This would not be possible without our panelists. And with that said, we've now reached the end of today's webinar. So please do let us know what you think by filling out our webinar satisfaction survey. The link will be included in the chat very shortly. On behalf of our entire team, again, I want to extend the most heartfelt thank you imaginable to each of our speakers, Alexa Vaughn, Chris Downey, Stuart Schell, and Bill Letty, for sharing their knowledge, passion, and perspectives. And I very much want to thank all of you for joining us, engaging in the chat, and helping to make this conversation meaningful. We hope you're walking away today with new insights, new possibilities, and new understanding about how sustainability and universal design can work together to shape a more inclusive, equitable, and livable future for everyone. We do have one more universal design event at Starkloff Disability Institute before the year is over. It's set to take place on Thursday, November 13th at 11 a.m. Pacific and 1 p.m. Central. That's also 2 p.m. Eastern Time. This will be a hybrid event, so if you are in St. Louis, fantastic, you can join us in person. If not, we do have an online option available. It's very timely with everything we're talking about today. We're going to be talking about the future of universal design in St. Louis and what that looks like. We're going to have local folks coming out to discuss the future of travel, recreation, and residential living in our city. So we'll drop the link to register for that event in the chat if it is of interest. There will again be some continuing education units through AIA as part of that event. We hope to have some of you there with us. Additionally, if today's discussion resonated with you, we would love to stay connected beyond the screen. I will be sending some email follow-ups, one with the recording of everything, but also one with some different links to some things to stay connected. Next year, we are going to have even more webinars for you. And as an added bonus, we will be holding our 8th Universal Design Summit in the fall of 2026, right here in St. Louis, Missouri. And you might see some of these panelists come back as part of that summit. They will certainly get a link to the request for proposal when it is prepared. We do hope to see as many of you out there as possible. We're going to be offering continuing education units for a variety of fields and disciplines. There are going to be presenters, panels, vendors, valuable resources. You're not going to want to miss it. To make sure you stay in the loop, please sign up for our mailing list. We'll put that link in the chat as well. In the meantime, I hope everybody has the most amazing World Sustainability Day possible. And once we get the captions from today's event cleaned up, we'll be sending out that recording, we'll be sending out the resources. And if you found value in this session, we encourage you to share the recording with as many people as possible so we can make a greater impact. We'll also follow up with those of you who requested AIA, continuing education units, or certificate of completion. So keep your eye on your inbox. Thank you again for being here, for the work you're doing in your life to create a more sustainable and inclusive future. Enjoy the rest of your World Sustainability Day, and we look forward to being in touch again soon. In the meantime, take care, stay curious, and we hope to have your participation in our programming again very soon. Thank you.